Hi. As you can see, I'm about to tell you how we can assess creativity through its degrees of objectivity. There's going to be 3 steps. First, I will tell you a little bit about creativity assessment and the so-called criterion problem. Then I will show how we can solve this problem by adopting a relational ontology. And finally, I will show how this solution is implemented in what we have called the objection counting technique. So first, creativity assessment and the criterion problem. Creativity assessment is a strategic issue. Indeed, to detect what facilitates or hinders creativity, one needs to know when there is creativity and when there is not, and if possible, when there's lots of it and when there's only a little of it. Now, the main obstacle to do this has been a criterion problem. Creativity is generally defined as what is both novel and appropriate. The problem is that the meaning of these terms greatly depends on the context. Let's take an example. One could say that A Void by Georges Perec is quite creative because it was the first novel entirely written without the letter E, and because it conveys an acute sense of personal incompleteness. But these criteria are quite specific. They could not be applied to assess the creativity of, say, a chemical experiment, a painting, or a space engineering project, or maybe just another novel. So, of course, there have been several strategies to deal with this criterion problem. Probably the most popular is that of the consensual assessment technique. The idea is simple. It is to entirely bypass the question of the criteria. Here is how it works. You have a set of creative products, drawings for instance. You ask various experts to rate their creativity on a 1 to 5 scale, and you calculate the statistical reliability of their ratings. Now, the downside of this technique is that precisely because it does not tell us anything about the criteria that people use, there is no way to compare creativity scores across experiments. That is, we do not know if a score of 2 in one experiment equals a score of 2 in another experiment, which then considerably limits our ability to detect what facilitates or hinders creativity. In short, here is the challenge. We need to find a criterion that works no matter how creativity is defined in context. Well, to find such a criterion, we contend that we must first change the way we usually think of both creativity and objectivity. So let's now talk about the merits of adopting a relational ontology. Let's first briefly review how the nature of creativity has been conceptualized so far. There have been 2 main approaches. First, creativity has been regarded as something that is objective, that is, as something that inherently belongs to certain entities, whether they be individuals or products. Second, creativity has been regarded as something that is ultimately subjective, that is, as something that is attributed to certain entities by those who judge them creative. Now, what's interesting is that these 2 opposite perspectives are based on the same ontological premise, which is that creativity must have a single point of origin. That is, creativity must be either in the entity that is judged creative or in the person who deems it creative. Well, we contend that we have to break away from this ontology of inherence and adopt an ontology of relations. So what does that mean? It means first that we have to look at creativity not as what is in something, but as what passes through something. And more precisely, as what passes through anything that connects something with the notion of creativity. Let's take an example. An easy way to connect, say, a painting with the notion of creativity is to say, oh, this painting is creative. But I can also substantiate this assertion by saying that this painting makes me feel something I never felt before, that it is using colors that have never been used before, and that it follows an important rule for this kind of painting, which is to be joyful. Now note that this simple proposition has important implications. Indeed, if an entity exists by passing through other entities, then it doesn't make much sense anymore to say that what is objective is what inherently belongs to one particular entity, which means that we now have to rework the usual definition of objectivity. Here is what we propose. Objectivity is what objects to disconnecting a certain connection. For instance, an easy way for someone to interrupt the connection between the painting and the notion of creativity would be to say, no, this painting is not creative. But what is interesting is that the emotion I felt, the special kind of color I saw, and the rule I recognized could all be used to object to this disconnection. This doesn't mean that they would necessarily convince my interlocutor or resolve the argument. What this means is that creativity can fluctuate in terms of degrees of objectivity. More precisely, we can say that the degree of objectivity of a connection depends on the number of elements that object to its disconnection. So we believe we now have a solution to the criterion problem. That is, we have exactly the type of criterion that we were looking for. Indeed, the degrees of objectivity allow assessing creativity no matter how it is defined in context, well, precisely because they are integral to such contextual definitions. So let's now see how this solution can be implemented on an operational level. So let's talk about what we have called the objection counting technique. The first thing we need to do is to get access to connections with the notion of creativity. To do this, a good starting point is to focus on collective attempts to produce something creative, on brainstorming session, for instance. Why? Because in such circumstances, people need to express and defend what they believe to be creative. In other words, they need to render visible connections with the notion of creativity. Second, we need to be able to detect such connections. That is, we need to know the minimum requirements for a connection with both novelty and appropriateness to materialize. Such requirements, we believe, can be derived from the usual definitions of these terms. So for novelty, we need two periods of time such as P1 ends when P2 begins, and the assertion that an entity X marks the end of P1 and therefore also the beginning of P2. For appropriateness, we need a definition of what is desirable and the assertion that an entity X fits with this definition. Let's take an example. Let's say that two persons, A1 and A2, are standing in front of a painting, and A1 says, "See this high key of color? You did not see that in the early 19th century, and it so perfectly captures the light of this precise moment of the day." In this case, the entity X is a painting. The two periods of time are the early 19th and the time right after it. The painting is presented as what marks the end of the early 19th. What is desirable is to capture the light of a precise moment, and the painting is presented as doing exactly this. So in this case, we have a connection with the notion of creativity. Now what we need is to detect degrees of objectivity. So we're going to call a connection of level 1 objectivity a connection just like this one. That is, a connection that only meets the minimum requirements. What is interesting about this kind of connection is that it has just enough objectivity to be called into question. So A2, for instance, could say that such high key of color could be seen in paintings of the early 19th, which would cause the connection with novelty to dematerialize. She could also say that what really matters for a painting is not its color, but to have a balanced composition, which would cause the connection with appropriateness to dematerialize. Obviously, at this point, the objectivity of the connection with the notion of creativity would be null. But then A1 could retort that the pigments for this key of color were not available before the mid-19th, which would cause the connection with novelty to rematerialize. She could also say that capturing the light of a precise moment is quite important, for this allows representing the fleeting nature of existence, which would cause the connection with appropriateness to rematerialize. Of note, we once again have a connection with the notion of creativity. But this connection is not quite the same as before, for it now includes two additional elements of objection. So the level of objectivity is now 1, just like before, plus 2, so 3. So this is basically how the objection counting technique works. Now, as a conclusion, I'd like to emphasize why this technique might be important. First, it is the first to allow the comparison of any forms of creativity. It doesn't matter that we're talking about literature, chemistry, painting, or space engineering. The criterion remains the same. It is the degree of objectivity of the connection with the notion of creativity. Second, this technique gives access to the various things that may animate a conversation. For instance, emotions, rules, ideas, technologies, and whatnot. And this is important because these things too may fluctuate in terms of objectivity, which means, and this is my last point, that this technique allows us to search for all sorts of correlations between the degrees of objectivity of, say, a certain rule or a certain emotion and the degrees of objectivity of creativity. In other words, it allows us to precisely detect what facilitates or hinders creativity. That's it. Thank you very much for listening to this.